Humanity has always gravitated towards entertainment. You can't really blame them. Life can be repetitive, it can get boring. For a long time, we found escape through many different forms: theater, music halls, circuses. But around the late 19th century, something began to shift. Inventors started experimenting with photography, not just to capture still movements, but to imitate the movement itself. Over time, these experiments led to the invention of the kentograph, the first motion picture camera, and from there, the rest is history. Cinema was born. A new form of entertainment, yes, but more importantly to me, a new way to express oneself. Inventors like Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marie began experimenting with sequences of images to reveal movements invisible to the naked eye. This wasn't just science, it was innovation. To see life differently, to experience time and motion in ways that had never been possible. During the primitive years of filmmaking, directors were forced to experiment with the visual components of cinema. They didn't really have a choice. Film at its most basic level could only do one thing: show images. To watch a film in this era was simply to see. Filmmakers like the Lumiere brothers explored composition and framing, not in a theoretical sense, but initiatively. What mattered was what the camera captured, what was excluded from the frame, and how the image existed within time. Meaning came not from story but from observation. Georges Méliès experimented with staging and illusion, which is what we would later call mise en scène. But what fascinates me the most is that these terms didn't exist yet. Cinematography wasn't a discipline. Mise en scène wasn't a concept. There was no established language to follow. And yet, in the most primitive era of cinema, filmmakers were already experimenting with form, technique, and perception. This wasn't just the earliest form of experimental cinema, it was cinema in its most pure state, a visual medium. Before rules, before structures, before explanation. Cinema as seen. As film technology improved and became more accessible, more people began experimenting with this new medium. By the early 1900s, the novelty of moving images alone started to wear off. What once felt miraculous became familiar. There was only so much engagement mass audiences could extract from movement itself. Filmmakers responded by turning toward narrative. Films began to organize images into stories, beginnings, middles, and ends. Works like The Great Train Robbery introduced structure, while Georges Méliès incorporated visual storytelling and title cards into his films. Cinema was no longer just showing the world, it was arranging it. The gradual shift naturally led into the 1910s and into the work of D.W. Griffith. Griffith didn't invent cinematic language, he refined and unified it. Through editing, framing, and performance, he demonstrated how images can be arranged to guide emotion, imply psychology, and shape meaning. Cross-cutting created tension, close-ups created intimacy, editing became thought itself. With the birth of a nation, cinema reached a turning point. Narrative structure, visual storytelling, and editing merged into a system capable of exploring the human consciousness in ways never done before. This was cinema, at least in its most commonly accepted definition. But something had changed. Film was no longer only a visual medium, it became a language. And while it gained power, clarity, and mass appeal, it also lost something: ambiguity, openness, and the freedom to simply be seen. With the arrival of synchronized sound, the cinema of 1903 no longer existed. What was born as pure perception had evolved into communication. Cinema mutated. Over a century has passed since The Birth of a Nation was released, yet many of the techniques pioneered during that era still dominate cinema today. Editing patterns, narrative structures, emotional cues, they remain largely unchanged. If you look at the highest grossing films of the past decade, a pattern emerges. Audiences return to the same characters, the same worlds, the same stories, stretched endlessly forever. Comfort has become the defining feature of mainstream cinema. The rise of the cinematic universe represents what I see as the most recent evolution of this system. After more than 100 years of technological advancement, digital cameras, visual effects, immersive sound, cinema has never had more tools at its disposal. And yet, it often feels as though films are still being made for the same fundamental reason: entertainment. In 1896, the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station created awe, not through story or character, but through spectacle. The act of seeing motion itself was enough. Over time, cinematic language emerged. Editing and narrative, sound, structure, not to replace spectacle, but to sustain it. Language gave cinema longevity. It allowed the medium to grow, to evolve, to justify itself as art rather than novelty. But after more than a century of development, cinema finds itself in a familiar position. Audiences still go to theater for the awe. Today, the moving train has been replaced by Spider-Man. The scale is larger, the image is louder, the technology infinitely more advanced, but the impulse remains unchanged. We gather to watch something to move, to be overwhelmed by motion and scale. The difference is now that spectacle is carried by cinematic language. This is not a return to primitiveness, it's a mutation. Cinema did not abandon its evolution, it consumed it. Narrative, editing, and sound now exist in service of the same awe that once belonged to a train pulling into a station. And to me, cinema has now gone full circle. I call this some form of cinematic suicide. Is there anything after? I'm not sure. Nor do I think it's my question to answer. Cinema is an infinite space that continues to expand and devour itself. Cinema is a cave mouth